Chapter 1 My Cherished Lifelong Wish. Mother of Peace and God shall wipe away all tears from their eyes. Chapter 1 Part 1. A woman shouts, Mansei, for independence. It was the first day of March 1919, the beginning of spring by the lunar calendar's marking of seasons. The temperature remained below freezing, and the people of Anju, a village in Pyongan province of what is now North Korea, were experiencing biting frost. A woman braved the cold to cook her family's morning meal. She lit the wood fire and set rice on the stove, and then her attention shifted from the morning routine. She lifted her arms and, from the back of a cupboard, carefully took out an item wrapped in a plain cotton cloth. By the light of the fire and a ray of sunshine shining through a crack under the door, the woman untied the cloth to reveal another, larger and more substantial cloth, one with a red and blue, yin-yang symbol on a white background. As she laid it out on the table, the design on the larger cloth came into full view. It was a Korean flag. This emblem of her people was always in this woman's mind, even in her dreams. Feelings of sadness and deep emotion rushed into her heart. Hearing the soft cries of her daughter who was awakening, she rolled up the flag, wrapped it again, and returned it to the back of the cupboard. With their 5-year-old daughter on her lap, this village woman shared breakfast with her husband, who had returned from his early morning work in the fields. She then busied herself cleaning the kitchen, living room, porch and yard. A little after noon, trying to appear nonchalant, she left the house with an expectant heart, her daughter on her back and the flag in her bosom. A narrow gravel path to the Anju market meandered through her village. It joined a larger road, on which she met others making their way, a farmer leading a cow, a young man carrying a heavy load on an A-frame carrier, a mother with a bundle on her head. Some were walking at a leisurely pace, others quickly, all heading for the market. Arriving at her destination, the woman stopped in front of a vegetable stand, centrally located in one of the most crowded areas of the market. Her child awoke from her afternoon nap, taken on her mother's back. Turning her head, the mother quietly looked at her beloved daughter and smiled. To this daughter, her mother's smile was the most beautiful sight in the world. Suddenly, a loud shout burst through the quiet of the market. Korean independence. Mansei. As if she were a runner hearing the sound of the starting gun, the woman quickly pulled the Korean flag from her bosom. Waving it vigorously, she joined the crowd, shouting Mansei, victory for 10,000 years. With all her strength, she shouted, Korean independence. Mansei. The first shout had been a signal, and all at once, people in the market were taking out Korean flags, and vigorously waving them high above their heads. From every corner of the open market, cries of Korean independence, Mansei, reverberated. This woman's voice was the loudest of all. Shocked by the sudden melee and scores of Korean flags bursting into view, market-goers unprepared for the uprising had to decide what to do. Some fled in fear of possible consequences. Others, the ones who believed in their nation's independence, joined the ranks of the demonstrators. The woman had been eagerly awaiting this day. She had stayed up many nights with her daughter, sewing her nation's flag, her hands shaking. Sitting under a kerosene lamp, she spoke to her daughter about Korea, its people, its faith, its ageless traditions, and the meaning of the Mansei independence movement. Listening to her mother, the little girl nodded her head, taking in everything. Now, clinging to her mother's back, she heard the shouts of Mansei. She felt the innocence and righteousness of her countrymen and women, dressed in white, ready to lay down their lives for the sake of their nation's right to exist. The March 1st independence demonstrations took place not only in Anju, they occurred simultaneously in Seoul and across the nation. At most sites, they included a public reading of the Korean Declaration of Independence. This public outcry was not feudal symbolism, it was an act of peaceful, nonviolent protest, an acclamation that the Korean people will cherish for eternity. Within moments, the demonstrators' ears were assaulted by the sound of whistles and boots. With batons and rifles, dozens of policemen converged upon the market. They mercilessly struck everyone in their path. Right and left, people were beaten to the ground, bloodied. The policemen did not distinguish between man or woman, young or old. Desperate to protect her daughter, this mother had no choice but to hold back her tears and retreat. Although she was filled with the resolve to stand to the last, she knew that God's wish is for human fellowship, and that bloodshed would only increase the burden of pain in God's heart. And there was something else. Something told this mother that it was not yet time for her nation to rise. It told her that in the future of Korea, a woman would be born with an unprecedented destiny, a woman who would break the mold of this fallen world. With this light of hope in her heart, she endured the humiliation of that afternoon. In accordance with God's providence and the absolute faith and love of Christian believers since biblical times, what that woman conceived in faith entered the world 24 years later. To her lineage, the only begotten daughter of God was born, as the one called to fulfill that woman's dreams. Anju was my birthplace. It was an epicenter of Korean patriotism, and it is no coincidence that it was an area in which Christianity was first introduced to Korea. That woman was my grandmother, Jo Won-mo, and she continued her support of the independence movement, and she engaged her daughter, my mother, and me in her activities. I was just 2 years old when my nation's history took its next turn, liberation from Japanese occupation. On that day, August 15, 1945, my grandmother Jo Won-mo had a child on her back while she shouted, "Mansei." But this time, the child was me. And this time my grandmother was shouting and waving our national flag with joy and delight for our nation's newfound freedom. God chose our family, a family of 3 generations of only daughters. Jo Won-mo, my grandmother, a woman who committed her heart to the independence movement, was an only daughter. Hong Soon-ae, my mother, a woman who single-mindedly committed her flesh and blood to fulfill her faith that she would meet Christ at his second advent, was her only daughter. I was her only child, the only daughter of the 3rd generation. Among the oppressed people of the Korean peninsula, God's only begotten daughter was born. As I write these words in 2019, the centennial of the March 1st independence movement, I am pursuing my forebears' dream, the dream of the ages, the completion of God's providence of salvation throughout the earth. The end of Chapter 1, Part 1. A woman shouts Mansei for independence.
Mother of Peace, and God shall wipe away all tears from their eyes. Chapter 1, Part 2. Thank you. Mother, please take care of everything.
Moon, moon, bright moon, the moon with which Lee Tae-beck used to play. Far away on that moon, there is a cinnamon tree. I cut it down with a jade axe, and trimmed it with a gold axe, to build a small cottage, where I attend my mother and father. I want to live with them forever. I want to live with them forever. While laden with sadness, this traditional Korean song also stirs and uplifts the heart. The wish to live forever with one's mother and father conveys the heart of filial piety. We are orphans, far from the heavenly parent whom we have lost, and we have to find our true parents and our original homeland. Nothing leads to greater happiness than being able to attend the beloved parents for whom we long, be it in a palace or a small hut. Everything and everyone loves the sun. Only with the sun can life flourish. The moon, on the other hand, bestows something else. The sun represents splendor, the moon tranquility. When people are far from home, they tend to think about their hometown and long for their parents while looking at the moon, not at the sun. I have fond memories of gazing at the moon together with my husband. We watched it with many members during the Korean Chuseok Harvest Festival and at the first full moon of the new year. Nonetheless, those moments were rare. My husband and I could not immerse ourselves in such tranquility. After this work is done, my husband would always say, and so would I, after this work is finished and we have a bit of free time, we'll be able to take a break. Over our years of ministry, one would think there would have been brief moments to relax after completing an urgent task. But for us, free time never materialized. Spurred on by the thought of my grandmother Jo crying Mansei For the independence and salvation of our nation, I burned with a youthful passion for saving humanity and building a peaceful world. I have always held high the banner of peace, inheriting the March 1st independence movement's noble spirit of nonviolence and self-determination. Because I lived with this sense of urgency, I found myself accomplishing what I would never have imagined possible. Throughout my life, I have done my utmost to fulfill all the tasks that have come to me. I have striven to dedicate myself to living for the sake of others with one heart and one will. I have never given my body the rest it needs. Many were the times I neglected to eat or sleep. My husband, Reverend Dr. Sun Myung Moon, who is often known as Father Moon, was the same. He was born with a strong physique, and had he taken better care of his health, he would have had more time to work for a better world. But he too followed God's will with unflinching devotion, and this damaged his health, ultimately to the point of no return. Up to 4 or 5 years before his ascension in 2012, he was in continual motion, living each day as if it were 1,000 years. His work was strenuous, both physically and spiritually. For example, he often spent entire nights in a small fishing boat on rough seas. He did this for the sake of others, setting an example for our Ocean Church members as well as leaders who accompanied him. He wanted to help them cultivate patience and the spirit to overcome hardship. Father Moon constantly traveled between continents, and it usually was between East and West, which takes a much greater toll than traveling between North and South. Considering his age, he traveled far too often between Korea and the United States. He should have limited such trips to once every 2 to 3 years, but he would not consider it. The year before his passing at age 92, he traveled between Korea and America at least 8 times. This was a complete self-sacrifice, offered solely for God and humankind. Father Moon's daily schedule itself was grueling. Every morning he would rise at 3 a.m., exercise, pray and study. At 5 a.m. he led Hoondaki, which means gathering to read and learn, with followers. It was a time of devotional scripture reading, prayer and instruction. During Hoondaki, my husband had so much to share that it was not uncommon for it to continue for up to 10 hours, skipping breakfast and lunch. No sooner would he conclude the session than he would grab a quick bite and depart to visit a movement project. In the final years, while in Korea, he would travel by helicopter to Jeomun Island or Yeosu, where we were developing fishing, recreational and educational facilities. Into his 70s, Father Moon could handle this physically, but in his last decade it would wear him out, and he would end up with a cold or worse. Of course he would ignore the symptoms. And then, during the summer of 2012, he caught a deep chest cold that was particularly alarming. We should have gone to the hospital immediately, but he kept postponing it, saying over and over, "We can go after this is done." Eventually, the decision was non-negotiable. He had to go to the hospital. His body was already in a very fragile state. He was hospitalized for a short time, but as soon as his medical examinations were finished, he stubbornly insisted on being discharged. We tried to persuade him to stay longer, but he wouldn't listen. "I still have a lot of work to do. I can't just sit here in hospital," he said, scolding the people who advised him to stay. There was no choice but to discharge him. That was August 12, 2012. We arrived home, and all of a sudden he said, "I want to have breakfast sitting opposite you, Oma." The members who heard this weren't sure they heard him right, because I always sat next to my husband during meals, not facing him. And then, when the food was served, my husband seemed uninterested in eating. He just gazed at me as if he were trying to engrave my face in his heart. I smiled and placed a spoon in his hand and something from the side dishes on his plate. "These vegetables are delicious, so take your time to eat," I said. The next day, the sun was unusually strong, even for midsummer. In the oppressive heat, Father Moon toured parts of our Chunwon complex on the shores of Cheongpyeong Lake, accompanied by an oxygen tank larger than himself. Upon his return to our home, Chunjeonggung, he asked me to bring a voice recorder. With the recorder in his hand, he fell into deep thought for 10 minutes, and then little by little, began recording his thoughts. He stated that when we transcend the history of the fall and return to the original Garden of Eden, following only God, we can then move in the direction of the kingdom of heaven. He also proclaimed that we can restore nations through fulfilling the mission of guiding our tribes. It was a soliloquy and prayer that embraced the beginning and the end, the Alpha and Omega. Everything has been accomplished. I offer everything to heaven, he said in closing. Everything has been brought to its consummation, completion, and conclusion. This turned out to be true Father's final prayer. With it, he brought his life to a close. Breathing with some difficulty for a moment, he squeezed my hand tightly. Mother, thank you. Mother, please take care of everything. I'm so sorry and I'm truly grateful, he said, struggling to get the words out. Again and again he said those same words. I held his hand more and more firmly, and with warm words and loving eyes, holding back the tears, I reassured him that everything would be all right. Don't worry about anything. On September 3, 2012, my husband, Reverend Dr. Sun Myung Moon, ascended into God's embrace. He was 93 years old, by the Korean way of counting, and was laid to rest in the Banyangwon, which means the garden in the original hometown, beside a pond on Mount Chinzong. I have often slipped into deep thought gazing at the moon rising above Mount Chinzong. I cut it down with a jade axe and trimmed it with a gold axe, to build a small cottage where I attend my mother and father. I want to live with them forever. I repeat this poem to myself, over and over. The end of Chapter 1 Part 2. Thank you. Mother, please take care of everything.